will bias BOEM's previously scientific process toward big oil billionaire polluters over everyday Americans. This is so clearly political, and it is all part of this administration's misguided drill, baby, drill energy policies that are taking us backward. They're locking us into another generation of fossil fuel fealty when we should be empowering the nation to transition to a clean energy future. Democrats will continue to fight for the climate, for clean energy, cleaner air to breathe and water to drink, healthy ecosystems, and thriving coastal communities, while our Republican colleagues are selling off your lands and your future to the oil and gas industry and doing their dirty work. Thank you. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion? I recognize myself, and I am pleased to support H.R. 2556, the CORE Act led by Representative Hunt. This important legislation improves how we map and measure our offshore energy resources. It's been said that you can't manage what you can't measure, and that's very true when we talk about our energy resources. I know some people would like to not manage our resources and maybe pretend they're not there and leave them alone, but we know that in this world we need more energy as we look at data centers, as we look at the demands that we see basically everywhere on increased energy demand. We definitely, as Congress, as an administration, as the American public, need to use the tools and the resources that we have to accurately measure the resources that we have so we can manage those resources in the best way possible. Under the prior administration, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, prepared resource assessments using outdated and manipulated methodologies to create artificially low estimates of the energy resources available on the outer continental shelf. In order to improve accuracy and to restore public trust, H.R. 2556 directs BOEM to use up-to-date tools like seismic surveys, AI, and advanced computing to assess oil, gas, and mineral reserves. The bill also establishes a 5-year cycle for BOEM to report on resources, jobs, and the consequences of not developing those resources. To me, that sounds like using the modern tools, using our ability to analyze, and using our good sense to be able to make the best decisions so that these resources can be managed for the best scenario possible, not just for today, but for tomorrow and the future. Also, H.R. 2556 supports cooperation with foreign allies to manage shared resources and avoid boundary disputes over hydrocarbon reserves, promising to improve decision-making clarity and joint production feasibility. I want to thank Representative Hunt for his important work on preparing this legislation, and I yield back. Is there further discussion on the bill? Hearing none, it is now in order to consider amendments to H.R. 2556. I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hunt, for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute designated Hunt 019ANS. Without objection, the amendment is considered read and open to amendment at any time. Mr. Hunt, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support this amendment to the nature of a substitute, which makes several technical improvements to the bill itself. It's saying that streamlines key provisions and removes duplicative language. The changes do not alter the substance of the bill, but they do strengthen it for its eventual passage and implementation. I encourage my colleagues to support this ANS and underlying bill. I yield back the remainder of my time, sir.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion on the amendment, it is now in order to consider amendments to the ANS to H.R. 2556. Recognize Ranking Member Huffman for the purpose of offering an amendment designated Huffman number 1. Without objection, the amendment is considered read.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So my colleagues across the aisle say that the CORE Act is intended to thoroughly study the energy and economic potential of our offshore resources. And Mr. Chairman, you just said it, that you see this as an important way to properly measure those resources. It's about measuring resources. Well, okay, I have an amendment here that would actually do that, specifically by directing these studies to include the part that you've left out of this bill, an assessment of offshore wind. including its economic benefits and job creation potential, which has enormous potential, by the way, to power our country and to create thousands of family-sustaining jobs. As recently as a few months ago, many of my colleagues across the aisle claimed to support an all-of-the-above national energy policy. But something has changed when Donald Trump and Project 2025 rolled in to the White House, and we need to talk about that. If this legislation is as straightforward and scientific as we're hearing, my colleagues should not mind adding offshore wind to the mix. But unfortunately, congressional Republicans have sat idly by these past few months as President Trump has waged a war on offshore wind, pausing permitting, slashing BOEM's budget for anything other than oil and gas. These political actions are having disastrous consequences for an industry that is ready to go. They are planning to invest $65 billion in projects by 2030, assuming they're allowed to proceed. This industry, this uncertainty that you're creating now for this industry is affecting shipbuilders in Louisiana, union construction workers at ports, manufacturing jobs all over the country. There are 73 gigawatts of planned offshore wind capacity in this country, enough energy to power 30 million homes. This administration's recklessness is putting some of that into question, directly counter to this stated goal of energy dominance. I will also add, do you know what energy isn't subject to price spikes because of reckless acts of war? Homegrown renewable energy like offshore wind. It just makes an awful lot of sense. So while the Trump administration is kneecapping offshore wind projects, the U.S. is falling further and further behind on the global stage. We need to be smart about the investments we're making. We shouldn't direct the Department of Defense every 5 years to do a study about cannons and bayonets. We shouldn't do something that backward in the space of energy policy as well. Offshore wind has tremendous potential to bring economic growth and jobs to coastal communities across America, and on top of that, it will be critical in our fight against climate change. So it's time to turn away from this outdated energy policy of drill, baby, drill, and look to the future. The future is renewable energy. Plus, this is simply about a study, folks, right? That's what this bill is. What are you afraid of? Why are you afraid to include our offshore wind potential in that examination? If we're going to study the economic potential of our offshore resources, it is just common sense to get the full picture. I urge adoption of this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? I recognize myself. Mr. Huffman, I think we agree that, well, I would say I agree that we need all forms of energy to meet the energy demands that are out there. And I know that without fossil fuels, we will fall far short, but that doesn't mean that we still don't need wind and solar where applicable. And we also need geothermal, which I think is something that we can work on in this committee together. And also, I think there's opportunity for using biomass and other renewables to produce the massive amounts of energy that are in demand right now and will only grow in the future. However, your amendment, I believe, is duplicative. There's already a process that's already being conducted by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory within the Department of Energy and to measure the potential for wind, and I think this would just be duplicative to add it to the bill today. So I oppose the amendment, but I'm not opposed to all forms of energy. Is there any further, I yield back, is there any further discussion on the amendment?
Could I ask a question, Mr. Chairman? So if I agreed to simply incorporate that study into this as the amendment so that what comes out of BOEM will be a complete picture, would I have your support? I mean, I don't want to duplicate anything either, and it sounds like you're open to all of the above energy considerations. So let's just make the report out of BOEM complete by folding in that study.
As I said, it would be duplicative. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion on the amendment, the question is on the amendment offered by Ranking Member Huffman, designated Huffman number 1. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed on. A recorded vote has been requested. Further proceedings on the amendment will be postponed. I recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Brownlee, for the purpose of offering an amendment designated Brownlee number 2. Without objection, the amendment is considered read.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The full name of H.R. 2556 is the Comprehensive Offshore Resource Enhancement Act. So let's be honest, there is nothing comprehensive about the evaluation required in this bill. If we were truly interested in conducting a comprehensive evaluation of developing offshore oil and gas resources, then this bill would require an analysis of the full range of impacts, not just cherry-picked economic factors. As written, the Core Act upends the long-standing, nonpartisan, scientific-based process the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has used for decades to assess offshore resources. It directs BOEM to expand its analysis to emphasize job creation and so-called global competitiveness without any meaningful requirement to weigh the environmental costs or climate risks. And let's put this into context. We are already the world's leading producer of oil and gas. Oil and gas CEOs are raking in record profits. Only 20% of the acres the oil and gas industry controls in the outer continental shelf are producing oil and gas. This bill looks a lot less like a data-driven policy and a lot more like a handout to the oil and gas industry. It also ignores the very real harms of offshore drilling, air and water pollution, threats to coastal economies, and surging greenhouse gas emissions that will continue to fuel the climate crisis. If we are going to direct resources for BOEM to conduct additional analyses, those studies should be truly comprehensive, not just a thinly veiled attempt to justify more drilling. That is why my amendment would require a full evaluation of the climate change and public health impacts of developing these resources. Since January, this administration and House Republicans have moved full steam ahead with efforts to dismantle our progress on climate action. But the reality is, no one is immune from the consequences of climate change. Right now, Washington, D.C. and much of the East Coast are sweltering under the first major heat wave of the summer and the first major heat wave in a decade. These dangerous temperatures are becoming more frequent and more severe, and we know why. Unchecked emissions and an over-reliance on fossil fuels. My amendment would require BOEM to assess how the greenhouse gases from additional drilling would affect our ability to limit warming to below 2 degrees Celsius, a threshold outlined in the Paris Agreement and critical to avoiding the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. As everyone knows, the harms of fossil fuel production and the climate crisis doesn't stop with rising temperatures. More drilling means more pollution in frontline communities, more extreme storms, wildfires, and heat waves, and more lives put at risk. That is why my amendment would also require an analysis of these associated public health risks. If we're going to claim this bill is comprehensive, then let's make sure it actually is. We have a responsibility to our constituents to ensure our energy policy is grounded in science, guided by public interest, and responsive to the challenges of our time, not written to benefit one single industry. I urge support of my amendment, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? I recognize myself. I oppose this amendment. And we already know that oil produced offshore in the U.S. waters is the cleanest in the world. Shutting down U.S. production in the name of an unrealistic climate goal will only shift production overseas, often to regimes with lower environmental standards and higher emissions per barrel. As I mentioned earlier, we're in a real race on AI and on data centers and manufacturing. And I think if we will do a realistic examination of our ability to produce energy in America, we'll see that we have fallen behind. And a lot of that is because we have been unrealistic on meeting our energy demands, and we're shutting down coal plants. There's been an attack on natural gas, which is one of the cleanest fuels that we can burn. And in the meantime, the country that we're in somewhat of a Cold War with on developing AI technology is China, and they're building over 100 gigawatts of coal-powered plants this year. That's 3 coal-powered plants every week. Now, personally, I think I wouldn't be upset if we had never discovered this technology of AI, but it's here and it's real, and we're in a real race to be able to develop it the quickest. I was at an event that some of you may have been at the Library of Congress, where the former CEO of Google, who is very much in the past has been alarmed about the amount of carbon we're putting in the atmosphere, but he said if we lose the race on AI, we more or less lose the race. And if we can get the AI technology faster, that any problems we have with atmospheric carbon, AI will help us solve that. So I see a bigger issue here. And we need to be assessing the amount of energy that we have as quickly as possible. We need to be developing it responsibly. And we're already at a point where China's at 30% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, and we're below 13%. So we can't think that we can operate in a vacuum and neglect our energy sources and rely on the rest of the world to solve the problems that we have. I oppose the amendment, and I yield back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Huffman, you're recognized.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Look, we agree that China uses too much coal, but the piece that gets left out is that China is running laps around us on clean energy technology, and they are absolutely on a trajectory to transition away from fossil fuel to clean energy, while Republicans and Donald Trump are trying to take us back to the 19th century. Look, when I hear this line about how we have the cleanest oil in the world, that is such a hollow argument. It's like having the prettiest horse at the glue factory. It's not clean. It is not safe. And if you think that this offshore oil in the Gulf is so darn clean, why not support Ms. Brownlee's amendment, which would simply have some analysis of that? And we saw with my previous amendment that Republicans want to have blinders on when BOEM does this energy potential analysis every few years. You don't want them to consider offshore renewables. You will not allow that to be part of the consideration. And now I guess we're going to find out whether you want to have another set of blinders on where you don't get to look at the impacts, the obvious impacts, including the so-called cleanness or not of all of this offshore oil development that you want to unleash. This is a good amendment. I think anyone who wants an honest look at the pros and the cons of all of this fossil fuel boosterism we continue to hear at this committee should support it, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Ms. Dexter, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to yield my time to Congresswoman Brownlee.
Thank you, Ms. Dexter. Actually, the ranking member really put forward my arguments, but I will say, Mr. Chairman, when you talk about the race of AI, I agree with you on that it's incumbent on our country to stay ahead of that race, and it's critical to our future. However, upholding the Paris Agreement is also critically important for the future of our planet and of our globe in terms of making sure that we have clean air and clean water around the world. So it seems to be only in this room and only in this Congress that no one wants to support the Paris Agreement, this administration, I should say. But all the other signers of the Paris Agreement are moving forward. We are behind. We need to move forward. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion, the question is on the amendment offered by Ms. Brownlee, designated Brownlee number 2. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Julia, do you want to record a vote?
A recorded vote has been requested. Further proceedings on this amendment will be postponed. Recognize the gentlewoman from Arizona, Ms. Ansari, for the purpose of offering an amendment designated Ansari number 3. Without objection, the amendment is considered read.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since day one of the Trump administration, federal public servants have been fired left and right by President Trump and his former crony Elon Musk. While the Trump administration refuses to share details on the full extent of these firings, we do know from court records that President Trump initially fired 1,712 employees at the Interior Department before being ordered to rehire them. On top of this, President Trump's proposed budget slashes funding for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management by 30%. This includes entirely cutting the renewable energy program and significant cuts to environmental review and enforcement. Even before these cuts, BOEM, which would be responsible for carrying out the CORE Act, struggled to fully carry out its responsibilities. For instance, just last year, GAO found that BOEM consistently fails to ensure that operators have the financial and technical capacity to decommission their offshore infrastructure. The CORE Act will require BOEM to conduct additional studies of offshore oil and gas resources in areas historically protected from drilling, like the Atlantic, Florida's Gulf Coast, and national marine sanctuaries, all without considering the negative impacts of oil and gas development. These bias studies will be time-consuming, burdensome, and expensive. On top of that, the legislation encourages BOEM to prioritize harmful seismic surveys, which essentially amounts to Interior doing big oil's dirty work for them, at the taxpayers' expense and harming wildlife and fisheries along the way. This is a waste of BOEM's time and energy, of taxpayer money, all to do big oil a favor by allowing large-scale seismic prospecting of U.S. coasts. We must think critically about how we utilize agency time and resources, which are becoming increasingly scarce under the Trump administration. Before encouraging BOEM to expand its workload as a favor to big oil, let's make sure that BOEM's essential programs are fully staffed and resourced to fulfill their current responsibilities for all of our offshore energy resources, not just oil and gas. My amendment would do just that. Because let's not forget that while this bill is called the Comprehensive Offshore Resource Enhancement Act, it leaves out a major source of clean, affordable American energy, offshore wind. We're facing likely global oil price volatility as the president drags us into an unwanted, unwarranted war through his unconstitutional and unilateral bombing of Iran. Meanwhile, here in D.C. and across the country, people are already facing skyrocketing energy bills just to stay safe in the extreme heat wave. Doubling down on fossil fuels shackles us to chaotic, volatile global markets while feeding into the extreme weather that is threatening our constituents' lives and driving up all of our energy bills. Investing in clean energy is true energy independence. No more handouts to big oils until our agencies are fully equipped for the responsible management of all of our offshore resources. I urge support for my amendment, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? I recognize myself. I oppose this amendment, and we are an authorizing committee, and funding and staffing questions should be referred to the Appropriations Committee. So this amendment is really trying to appropriate on an authorization. It's also an attempt to continue out of control government expense and spending, and I don't think it's proper for this bill. I oppose it, and I yield back. Is there further discussion on the amendment?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Huffman, you're recognized.
Thanks. I'm just confused. I mean, saying that, we're just going to do authorization and policy and let other committees deal with the finances makes no sense to me when you have a bill that is proposing a whole bunch of new taxpayer-funded seismic testing as a total favor to the oil and gas industry. There's no question that that is what is reflected in this bill, and Ms. Ansari is offering an amendment to make sure that if we're going to go down that path of even more giveaways to the richest industry in the history of the world, while we're taking food away from the most vulnerable families in America, that at least we're going to make sure that BOEM's other key functions are fully funded and we're not sacrificing those. It just seems like a complete deflection to try to suggest that we're not dealing with the financial aspects of this policy shift that this bill would set in motion. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? There's no further discussion. The question is on the amendment offered by Ms. Ansari, designated Ansari number 3. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. A recorded vote has been requested. Further proceedings on the amendment will be postponed. Recognize the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Dexter, for the purpose of offering an amendment designated Dexter number 4. Without objection, the amendment is considered read.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. This bill, or the amendment, would tip the scales of our federal offshore oil and gas problem. Sorry, it is the bill. Would tip the scales of our federal offshore oil and gas program toward unchecked development, promoting biased reviews with minimal to no concern for carbon pollution, public health, and environmental impacts. It is yet another effort to support fast-tracked energy development at the expense of our oceans and marine life. My amendment, number 4, no commercial deep-sea mining without international regulations, is straightforward. It would prohibit deep-sea mining on the U.S. outer continental shelf and in international waters until 2 basic safeguards are in place. Number 1, the International Seabed Authority adopts internationally agreed-upon commercial regulations. And number 2, the United States ratifies the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea. Why? Because tucked within this bill is yet another provision that could pave the way for deep-sea mining before we understand its full consequences for ocean ecosystems. President Trump recently issued an executive order to accelerate deep-sea mining, not just inside our national jurisdiction, but also in international waters. Such a move would violate international law, strain relations with the Pacific communities, and set a dangerous precedent for unilateral exploitation, a precedent we should not be encouraging for ourselves nor anyone else. It would open the door for adversaries like China and Russia to justify expanding their own maritime drilling and exploitation. The risks are enormous. Large-scale deep-sea mining could unleash a chain reaction of destruction in our oceans. We are only now just beginning to understand the extraordinary wealth of biodiversity in the deep sea and the crucial role these ecosystems may play in regulating carbon. Deep-sea mining could permanently damage these ecosystems before we even understand what we're losing. Deep-sea mining could disrupt entire midwater food webs, including tuna, whales, and other fisheries we clearly rely on. And coming from a Pacific Coast state, this is an incredibly important industry for us. And all for the minerals that may not even have a market. If it is feasible, deep-sea mining is extremely expensive, and technology is quickly moving away from many of the target minerals. But despite the global risks and over international objections, some deep-sea mining companies are doing everything they can to push forward with their plans. This bill is yet another troubling first step toward the administration's broader agenda to greenlight exploitation of our resources, and deep-sea mining without the necessary regulations to protect our most fragile ecosystems is an absolute mistake. The stakes are too high, ecologically, economically, culturally, and for international relations to rush into a deep-sea mining without the necessary safeguards. This is a simple request. It follows international law. I urge support for my amendment, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? I recognize myself. I oppose the amendment, and the bill has nothing to, or does nothing to authorize deep-sea mining or impact the regulatory process for exploitation of resources. So I think that would be enough to oppose the amendment, but since we're talking about deep sea mining, I would like to address that, that topic as well. This amendment would tie the hands of U.S. agencies and companies. It would surrender sovereignty to an international bureaucracy, and it would block our access to critical mineral resources, all in exchange for promoting a treaty that the U.S. has repeatedly rejected. This committee has jurisdiction over mineral resources on the Outer Continental Shelf within the exclusive economic zone and in international waters. This amendment effectively cedes the authority to the Senate, but worse than that, it cedes authority to the United Nations and other unelected international organizations. The House Committee on Natural Resources has no jurisdiction over treaties or international legal instruments like the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. Conditioning U.S. mineral development on international treaty ratification is not only outside the bounds of the committee's scope, it also risks undermining the House's constitutional role in setting resource development policy. Congress already passed the Deep Sea Hard Mineral Resources Act in 1980, giving NOAA the authority to issue exploration and mining license. The U.S. has maintained seabed claims, entered bilateral and multilateral agreements with key nations, and published its claims to the UN under existing law, all without UNCLOS. America doesn't need permission from the United Nations to lead. We already have the legal tools, the diplomatic channels, and the strategic interest to move forward. Again, I oppose the amendment, and I urge my colleagues to join me in doing so. I yield back. Is there further discussion on the amendment?
I just
you're
want to
recognized.
say, Mr. Chairman, how pleased I am to hear you say that you're standing up for Congress's constitutional role. I mean, that's the best thing I have heard in months in this Congress. I have nothing more to say. Yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion, the question is on the amendment offered by Ms. Dexter, designated Dexter number 4. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. A recorded vote has been requested. Further proceedings on this amendment will be postponed. I recognize Ranking Member Huffman for the purpose of offering an amendment designated Huffman number 5. Without objection, the amendment is considered read.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This hearing is quite a 1-2 punch to our national marine sanctuaries. We'll be considering Mr. Carter's bill in a moment, which takes away the ability of NOAA to charge a reasonable market-based fee for undersea cable right-of-way access by huge tech companies. It takes away their authority to protect our marine sanctuaries from damage from a botched cable operation. And now we have this bill that would be the first step towards potentially opening up national marine sanctuaries to intrusive and polluting oil and gas development. So look, it's important, I think, to step back and remember that national marine sanctuaries protect underwater treasures across 600,000 square miles of U.S. oceans and Great Lakes waters. This includes places like Cordell Bank in my district, the Hawaiian Islands Humpback Whale Sanctuary, and the Florida Keys. Beyond the diverse marine wildlife that these special places contain, national marine sanctuaries are vital to coastal economies. The hotels, restaurants, water equipment rentals that surround these sanctuaries are major contributors to the U.S. economy. In 2021, America's marine economy saw a 7.4% growth in its contribution to our GDP. Recreation and tourism alone added $153 billion, but the Core Act threatens the environmental, economic, and cultural values of these sanctuaries. This bill would require BOEM to estimate the impact of these sanctuary protections on oil and gas production, opening the door for potential oil and gas surveys in sanctuaries to create these estimates. Elsewhere in the legislation, the bill prioritizes the acquisition of seismic data for transboundary reservoirs, areas where there may be oil and gas near our boundaries with Canada, Mexico, and Russia. These seismic surveys can emit explosion-like sounds every 10 seconds for hours at a time. That noise pollution disrupts feeding and breeding for whales and other marine mammals. diminishing their reproductive success and continued survival. Alarmingly, this would include North Atlantic right whale habitat off New England and southern resident orca habitat off Washington State, as well as the vast Arctic regions that President Obama withdrew from oil and gas leasing and that are already under stress from climate change. Taken together, it's a clear threat to our national marine sanctuaries and protected places, especially those near neighboring countries like the Florida Keys, Flower Garden Banks in the Gulf of Mexico, Stellwagen Bank, the Channel Islands off Southern California, and the Olympic Coast in northern Washington. We have a responsibility to be good stewards of our public waters and the species that depend on them for their well-being and for ours. By disrupting marine habitats, seismic testing will in turn disrupt local tourist economies, risking billions of dollars and millions of jobs. If our colleagues across the aisle are so set on this big oil giveaway of a bill, let's at least ensure that our national marine sanctuaries are not vulnerable to this nonsense. That's what this amendment does. I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Ms. Elford, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member Huffman, for bringing these concerns forward. I share many of your concerns. Representing Maryland, we all know all too well that what happens off the East Coast directly affects the waterways that are theoretically state waterways, but even just yesterday, I heard from colleagues across the aisle a deep appreciation for the fact that our fisheries don't respect the arbitrary state boundaries that we have put forward here in this room and across this nation. And so what happens offshore very much impacts what happens in state. So I have many concerns about the bills drafted. I would like to ask you a couple questions about your amendment because I think it clarifies some important pieces here, including the definition of state. It's my understanding that the bill is drafted any neighboring state without, now that we're taking away NOAA approval, could am I on the wrong? Pardon.
I think this may be a question for the Carter bill on national marine sanctuaries, if I'm not mistaken, which I'm happy to engage on, if that's where you're going.
It is.
Okay.
I apologize.
Can we hold this?
Please.
I want to have this
Yes,
conversation.
me too.
All right, thank you.
Does the gentlelady yield back? Yes. Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Ms. Randall, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I speak in strong support of Mr. Huffman's amendment as the representative from the Olympic Peninsula. And I was just out in Forks, Washington this last week on the West Coast up against part of the marine sanctuary that we are so lucky to have, because yes, it attracts tourism to our incredible region, but the tourism is being challenged right now already by cuts to Forest Service workers and national parks workers. We hear complaints about no trash cans in our beautiful, pristine wilderness. We are seeing fewer visitors from Canada come south to visit the Olympic Peninsula, and that is impacting not only the tourist machine that our federal service helps to fund, but also the small businesses on Main Street. Red businesses and blue businesses, hardware stores and pharmacies and hotels. Folks come to the Olympic Peninsula like they travel to so many of our marine sanctuary regions around the country because of the natural beauty that we have to offer. And because in some cases we have had great relationships with our neighbors in Canada. But a lot of that is being challenged right now by budget cuts. And I think this smart amendment by Mr. Huffman takes a little bit of a step to protect what tourist economy we can currently rely on, as so much is currently being eroded. I know that all my colleagues in this committee want to ensure that small businesses have the customer base that they need to thrive, so that entrepreneurs can invest their hard-earned money and their blood, sweat, and tears into growing a business that they'll be able to pass on to their children and their children's children. That's the American dream. But if we erode the natural resources that bring people to streets in Forks, Washington, there's nothing else that's going to bring them there, because we have no other economy in places like that where there's one road that gets people there and it washes out every year. So it's our duty to support the economies in communities that are dependent on our natural resources, like our marine sanctuaries. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? I recognize myself. I do oppose the amendment, and I'm amazed at the way this amendment has moved into a hypothetical situation on what it could do and may do, everything from destroying marine sanctuaries to small businesses. And if you look at the language of this bill, this is an amendment that's really in search of a problem that I think is built through hyperbolic thoughts on what could happen and might happen, but no one is proposing seismic testing in sanctuaries or marine monuments. These areas are already subject to rigorous environmental protections under existing law. The amendment is therefore, I would say, redundant at best. If future seismic work in sanctuaries is warranted, it is already required to comply with NEPA, the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and existing sanctuary regulations. We don't need a blanket prohibition buried in statute to further micromanage the law. I oppose the amendment and urge my colleagues to do the same. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion on the amendment, the question is on the amendment offered by Ranking Member Huffman, designated Huffman number 5. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Recorded vote.
The recorded vote has been requested. Further proceedings on the amendment will be postponed. Recognize the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Randall, for the purpose of offering an amendment designated Randall number 6 revised. Without objection, the amendment is considered read.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, what I love so much about this committee, and when I'm home in district, I often talk to my neighbors about how, of the 2 committees I serve on, this one is has a special place in my heart because we can have real policy discussions. And we also have a real unified support of tribal nations. You know, later on the agenda, we're marking up 2 of my bills, but some other bills that have positive impacts for the tribal nations across the United States that we, you know, are engaged in government-to-government relationships with. The members of this committee understand our treaty obligations and are eager to continue to uphold them and support the leadership of tribal councils around the country. My amendment is very simple and I think is in service of that priority that we all share. It would require that before any seismic testing take place as a result of this study, the Secretary must complete tribal consultation with potentially impacted coastal tribes. I've said it before, but I'll say it again. In my district, there are 12 federally recognized tribes, including several along the Washington coast. And our trust responsibilities extend beyond our lands. They extend into our waters. Tribal nations in the Pacific have treaty rights that guarantee them access to their usual and custom fishing areas. And tribal nations along the coast of the United States, as far as Florida, also deserve to be consulted as we undertake any work that disrupts our ocean landscape. Any actions taken within these areas should include consultation with tribes who may be impacted, and I urge this committee's support of my amendment.
So, gentlelady yield back. Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? I recognize myself. Although I agree with the gentlelady that we should work together on tribal issues, and we have had a track record of doing that, especially when it comes to tribal self-determination. I will say that I oppose this amendment because tribal consultation already occurs before offshore activities like seismic authorizations and permits can take place, and when there's a potential impact to tribal lands. But ultimately, when we're talking about offshore, such impacts are very rare. However, nothing in the bill would impact the requirements of Executive Order 13175, which requires agencies to consult where tribal interest may be impacted. For those reasons, I oppose the amendment, and I yield back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion, the question is on the amendment offered by Ms. Randall, designated Randall, number 6 revised. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. A recorded vote has been requested. Further proceedings on this amendment will be postponed. Pursuant to the committee markup notice, it is now in order to consider H.R. 275, Crow Revenue Act. Sorry, let me try that again. It's in order to consider H.R. 725, Crow Revenue Act. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Does any member wish to be recognized for purpose of debate on the bill? Mr. Hurd, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 725 and the ANS to H.R. 725 is about tribal sovereignty, energy security, and public access. The ANS improves upon the original in every one of those areas. The bill authorizes a land exchange between the Crow Tribe of Montana and the Hope Family Trust. It also sets up a revenue sharing agreement between the Hope Family Trust and the Crow Tribe for the development of the mineral estate conveyed to the Hope Family Trust. Under the legislation, the Crow Tribe regains ownership of approximately 4,600 acres owned by the Hope Family Trust within the boundaries of the Crow Reservation in Montana. In exchange, the Hope Family Trust receives approximately 4,500 acres of federal subsurface and 940 acres of federal subsurface interest. These tracts of land are situated above the Bull Mountain Mine, which is Montana's only underground coal mine. Importantly, the exchange is conditioned on the trust relinquishing its existing lease, which ensures a clean transfer. The Crow Tribe has supported this bill from the beginning. When the Absaloka mine closed in 2024, the tribe lost a critical source of revenue. This exchange helps fill that gap and restores the tribe's ability to live off the natural resources in their land. The ANS makes H.R. 725, which is a good bill on its own, even better. It provides for 959 acres of private surface land to be conveyed to the federal government. This exchange will unlock access to currently inaccessible public and state lands in the area. Overall, there will be an increase in public lands access through this legislation, something that we know sportsmen and conservation groups care deeply about. This is smart policy. It's a tribal sovereignty win, an energy security win, and a public access win. It aligns with President Trump's energy agenda by unlocking coal reserves and streamlining federal land transactions. I respectfully urge my colleagues to support the ANS. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. We haven't got to the ANS yet, but I will encourage people to support that when we get to that as well. Is there further discussion on the bill? Mr. Huffman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do oppose this bill, which is a modified version of legislation that we've seen several times over the last few years. It would mandate approval of the Bull Mountains coal mine owned by Signal Peak in Montana. And if that sounds familiar, it's because we saw another piece of legislation to automatically approve the mine in the Energy and Mineral Resources Subcommittee last month. And before that, the same language in Republicans' big, ugly bill. And then President Trump beat you to it. Earlier this month, the Bureau of Land Management and Office of Surface Mining and Enforcement used so-called emergency permitting procedures to approve the mine's expansion plans. The level of corruption here is just breathtaking. And to what end? I will remind colleagues that all of the coal from this mine is exported This is the poster child for why this administration's so-called energy emergency is so totally fake. Plus, Signal Peak is still wearing a corporate ankle bracelet. They only recently got off probation with the Department of Justice for labor and environmental violations. The company has been plagued by scandal after scandal. I quote one headline from the New York Times, quote, "A faked kidnapping and cocaine, a Montana mine's descent into chaos." Nice stuff here, folks. The Crow Revenue Act has been billed by its sponsors as delivering much-needed revenue to the Crow tribe, and look, I strongly support the Crow tribe's right of economic self-determination. I understand the need for revenue. I would love to work with them on a more efficient, transparent, and reliable way to do that. But right now, private landowners, the Hope family, own mineral rights to coal within the boundaries of the Crow Reservation in Montana. Under this bill, in exchange for giving their mineral rights to the tribe for those lands, the bill would give the Hope family over 4,000 acres of federal land and mineral rights in the nearby Bull Mountains. The ostensible idea is that the Hope family would sell or lease their new land to the Signal Peak coal mine, and the Crow tribe would share in some of the revenue from the Bull Mountains mine. There are a few problems with this. The bill was originally intended as simply a way for a coal company with a flagrant history of environmental and worker safety violations to skirt environmental review. The impacts of this mine expansion are enormous. Residents nearby already feel like they are not being heard. I will also remind my colleagues that the EIS for this mine has been struck down by the courts twice for inadequate review. But now that the Trump administration has authorized the expansion for this criminal company under a rushed and potentially illegal emergency procedure, it's unclear what the incentives are for the company to even do the exchange. Which brings us to our second problem, that the bill doesn't actually guarantee revenue for the tribe. The entire deal is at the discretion of Signal Peak, a known bad actor. For the land swap to move forward, Signal Peak has to offer to give up their lease with their now approved permits and enter into a land swap deal that could end up being held up in courts and challenges. If they decide that they're happy with their lease, as is, and the permits obtained under the emergency declaration, they can just keep mining without making any deal with the tribe. The ANS that our colleagues across the aisle are going to offer does not fix any of these problems. It attempts to address some community concerns about public access, although the public certainly has more concerns than that. We're going to see a Democratic amendment in a bit to actually address the revenue issue for the Crow tribe. But absent that, I urge opposition to this legislation, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the bill? I recognize myself and would say I would associate my remarks with the gentleman from Colorado and also add that this mine has been in operation since 2009. It's not a new mine. It's been hampered by a checkerboard pattern on the areas where it can mine. And under the previous administration, this nuance was used to try to shut the mine down, but they've been, I believe, operating on some state property, hoping they can get this rectified so that they can finish up the work that they're doing, and so that the Crow tribe can be compensated fairly for that. And for those reasons, I believe this bill is important. I support it, and I yield back my time. Is there further discussion on the bill? Hearing none, it's now in order to consider amendments to H.R. 725. And I'll now recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Hurd, for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute designated Hurd 18A and S. Without objection, the amendment is considered read and open to amendment at any point.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I will avoid repeating what I said before, but let me just say fundamentally the importance of this ANS is it advances principles of limited government and federalism. It facilitates voluntary transactions between willing parties and tribal entities, And also fundamentally, it supports tribal sovereignty. It upholds the trust responsibility of the Crow tribe and affirms tribal resource management. I think that's a laudable goal. It's one of the things that, as chairman of Indian Insular Affairs, talking about economic development in Indian country, I think it promotes that fundamental goal. And for that reason, I respectfully urge my colleagues to support the ANS, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the ANS? I recognize myself, and I want to thank the chairman of the Subcommittee on Indian and Insular Affairs, Representative Hurd, for sponsoring the ANS. The ANS through H.R. 725 does address concerns raised in the legislative process to ensure continued public land access for recreation and hunting. Specifically, it conveys an additional 959 acres of surface holdings to the federal government from Muscle Shell Resources LLC, the land holding company for Signal Peak Energy, which runs the Bull Mountain Mine. The acreage conveyed to the federal government is adjacent to state land that is currently inaccessible and is currently surrounded by private land. As a result, the ANS produces a net gain in public land access overall. I support the ANS and I yield back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion on the amendment, it's now in order to consider amendments to the ANS to H.R. 725. I recognize Ranking Member Huffman for the purpose of offering an amendment designated in sorry number 1. Without objection, the amendment is considered read.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am pinch hitting for the Energy and Mineral Resources Ranking Member, Ms. Ansari. As we have discussed, the legislation before us is very troubling, and for one part of that is that it contains a glaring loophole. It allows for a public-private land exchange that would result in a revenue-sharing agreement between the Crow tribe and the Hope family, who would own the newly privatized coal. But the entire agreement hinges on Signal Peak, which, as we've established many times over, is not a good actor, to put it kindly. This is a company that just got off probation with the Department of Justice, formerly had ties to Vladimir Putin, has been embroiled in scandal, including, and I quote, a faked kidnapping and cocaine. Signal Peak would have to proactively choose to relinquish the lease that it just received approval to mine from the Trump administration for this bill to even make sense. Ranking Member Ansari's amendment closes that loophole. If this amendment is adopted, the tribe would receive revenue as soon as the bill is passed by directing all revenue that would have gone to the federal treasury directly to the Crow tribe. This approach also addresses a couple of other issues. Under this amendment, the tribe would receive immediate revenue, but the federal government would maintain federal oversight of mine expansion, ensuring that Signal Peak is not off the hook for federal mine permits and enforcement. As written, the land exchange includes more land and more coal than the recently approved EIS, which surely requires federal review. The mine's impact is significant. It has dewatered springs, important for ranching and wildlife, caused major subsidence issues, and forced ranchers off their land. Not to mention, it's one of the largest single sources of emissions in the entire United States. Previous EISs for this mine expansion were blocked by the courts for inadequate review, but that certainly doesn't mean that the solution is to privatize or automatically approve the mine like other proposals would do. This amendment also solves the issue of revenue for Muscle Shell County, which is left out of the revenue sharing agreement in H.R. 725. Under this bill, the county and community would lose millions of dollars in royalties. Under the amendment, they would receive more revenue and could set up a fund to support the community in their economic transition. And finally, Ranking Member Ansari's amendment would require a DOI to improve its mitigation and reclamation plans. We know that the mine's mitigation measures, especially when it comes to water use, are not up to par. Water is so essential in the West. It is essential to communities' livelihoods, and we cannot treat this lightly. Reclamation must occur as soon as practicable. So I urge adoption of this amendment and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? I recognize myself. I oppose the amendment. I would say that this amendment undermines the tribal self-determination and Also, by striking Section 3 and replacing it with this amendment, it would gut the entire purpose of H.R. 725. It gets rid of the land transfer and prevents consolidation of the Crow tribe's homelands, which is the whole intent of the bill. Rather than restoring ownership to the Crow tribe, this amendment offers them a preordained cut of someone else's lease, keeping the tribe permanently dependent on the federal government and its dictates instead of empowering them with their own ability to control resources. Further, the Crow tribe wouldn't even get the promised revenues, as this amendment prevents the land transfer necessary to keep the mine running. The amendment entirely abandons negotiated tribal agreements and years of work by the Crow tribe to get this bill where it is today. Unlike the bill and the ANS, the amendment does not have the support of the local groups that are affected by this legislation. This amendment is Congress, I would say, at its worst, coming in late and dictating inflexible terms to tribal and local stakeholders. Let's leave that in the past. I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment, and I would also ask unanimous consent to submit to the record a letter from Frank White Clay, chairman of the Crow Tribal Indians, and he opens his letter by saying, "I write today to express the Crow Nation's unwavering and unequivocal support of H.R. 725, the Crow Revenue Act." The letter goes on to say, H.R. 725 provides a temporary and urgently needed funding source, offering us an opportunity to ensure critical services are provided to our people and allowing us to invest in our economic future. And Chairman Frank White Clay concludes his letter by saying, "Again, I urge all members of this committee to support this legislation and to give the Crow Nation a chance to have a brighter future." Without objection, so ordered. I yield back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Hurd, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I respectfully oppose the amendment offered by the member from Arizona. I echo the statement of the chairman on this amendment. The amendment abandons the structure and intent of a bill that's been negotiated in good faith by tribal and local stakeholders. The amendment substitutes a new policy approach midstream without hearings, without consultation, or tribal consent. I'm concerned that it would impose a top-down revenue formula rather than a tribally derived land-based long-term solution. Simply put, the amendment effectively acts as an unvetted and unwarranted rewrite of a bill that has the consensus of local and tribal stakeholders. I acknowledge Mr. Huffman's comments about Signal Peak. It is true that 7 years ago, Signal Peak's former leadership was involved in serious misconduct. I don't think there's any disputing that. The company was fined and multiple individuals were charged or convicted. That leadership has been removed. Signal Peak has since installed new executives and new compliance reforms. Those scandals are in the past. The Crow tribe should not be punished for wrongdoings that they had no role in. As chairman of Indian Insular Affairs, economic development is critical in Indian country. This ANS that's being offered is consistent with that laudable goal. This amendment would undermine the balanced and careful approach that this legislation would strike. And with that, I respectfully urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion, the question is on the amendment offered by Ms. Ansari, designated Ansari number 1. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed, but a recorded vote has been requested. Further proceedings on this amendment will be postponed. Pursuant to the markup notice, it is now in order to consider H.R. 261, Undersea Cable Protection Act of 2025. Ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Water, Wildlife, and Fisheries be discharged from further consideration of the bill. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Does any member wish to be recognized for purpose of debate on the bill? Mr. Huffman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When we held our hearing on this bill, I said that I thought sanctuaries and fiber optic cables don't have to be at odds, and I meant it. Cables already run through sanctuaries, including Olympic Coast, Greater Fairlawns in my district, Stellwagen, and Monterey Bay. But this bill is not about solving a real problem. It's about giving billion-dollar companies like Meta a free pass while forcing everyone else to play by the rules. Our national marine sanctuaries encompass 629,000 square miles of America's most precious marine treasures. They generate $8 billion annually and support tens of thousands of jobs in fishing, diving, tourism, and research. Most of that economic activity comes from small businesses that follow sanctuary rules and pay their fair share. The National Marine Sanctuaries Act requires activities in sanctuaries to be compatible with sanctuary purposes, and small businesses like dive boat operators, fishing guides, and whale watching tours all comply with sanctuary regulations. This bill would treat billion-dollar telecom companies differently. It would say they don't have to follow the same rules. The bill would eliminate NOAA's authority to conduct environmental reviews and charge fair market fees for telecom infrastructure. Now, the National Park Service and the Bureau of Land Management do charge rent when telecom companies use our public lands for their right-of-ways, but this bill would give big tech a free ride through our marine sanctuaries. That's a bad idea. We know what happens when oversight disappears. Just look at the 2020 incident where a Facebook subsidiary's cable project went sideways off the Oregon coast. Their drilling operation failed, and they left behind a trail of industrial debris, pipes, drilling fluids, and equipment scattered across the ocean floor, plus 2 sinkholes as a bonus. Facebook cut a check for damages and just moved on, but the environmental mess remained. Look, if you screw up undersea cable projects, it can cause serious damage to essential sanctuary features, benthic habitat, water quality, ocean noise levels. These are supposed to be pristine places, our sanctuaries, places where families can take their kids snorkeling to see colorful reefs, where whales migrate and feed, where fishing communities depend on healthy ecosystems. That's exactly why we need science-based environmental review, not blanket exemptions for big corporate donors. The sponsors claim this giveaway so-called streamlines urgent national security projects. Really? Meta's $10 billion, 25,000-mile global cable network is held up because NOAA might want to impose some conditions on the right-of-way through a national marine sanctuary? That's preposterous. The environmental review is a rounding error for these massive multi-year projects. So is the fair market rent that they might be asked to pay. This bill also tramples tribal sovereignty by eliminating consultation requirements with coastal treaty tribes who co-manage many sanctuaries and hold treaty rights that this bill simply ignores. Mr. Chairman, during our hearing, I offered to work with my colleagues in a bipartisan way on this issue, and that offer still stands. But this bill, as written, is a naked corporate welfare giveaway that forces small businesses to follow rules while giving big tech a free ride at taxpayer expense. Our sanctuaries and the communities that depend on them deserve a lot better than this corporate handout. So I urge a no vote and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the bill? So I recognize myself, and I speak in support of H.R. 261, the Undersea Cable Protection Act of 2025, sponsored by Congressman Buddy Carter. As we all probably know, undersea cables are critical to the increasing global economy. Historically, these cables have been anywhere from 1 to 2 inches in diameter and have been a critical piece of communication infrastructure for more than 170 years. Here's a modern cable, a smaller cable, and you can see these tiny fiber optics threads buried in the center of this cable. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about modern undersea cable. These cables currently connect every continent except Antarctica, and they carry about 95% of intercontinental global internet traffic and 99% of transoceanic digital cable communications, including trillions in international financial transactions. That happens on a daily basis. In other words, undersea cables are extremely important. Unfortunately, the current permitting structure makes it practically impossible for undersea cables to go through most federal waters on the West Coast. That is because many of these waters are designated as national marine sanctuaries and require yet another burdensome permitting process. There is no doubt that we must ensure that these projects are permitted in a reasonable time frame while protecting our natural resources. That is why this legislation does not exempt undersea cables from going through review under the National Environmental Policy Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Magnuson-Stevens Act, the National Historic Preservation Act, or the Coastal Zone Management Act. And these are just the statutes in our committee's jurisdiction. This legislation simply says that an additional special use permit under the National Marine Sanctuary Act is not required if all other permits have been issued. Over the last 20 years, project developers have been unwilling and unable to go through this process, which has led to an increase in the number of cables deployed in a limited number of routes. Among the many consequences of this issue, it can pose a grave national security threat. By removing this specific permit from the thorough, robust regulatory process for these projects, we can meet the future demands for these projects, we can ensure route diversity, and we can continue to be good stewards of our marine resources. I urge my colleagues to support the legislation, and I yield back. Is there further discussion on the bill? Hearing none, it is now in order to consider. Ms. Hoyle, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe H.R. 261 would hurt our marine ecosystems by allowing private companies to install, operate, maintain, repair, or recover undersea fiber optic cables in national marine sanctuaries without appropriate federal oversight. I don't oppose undersea cables, and I do support permitting reform, and I think there is a bipartisan way to do that where we don't throw out the oversight we need to protect our marine sanctuaries. My colleagues and I have many concerns with this bill as currently written. We believe it undermines the very purpose of our national marine sanctuary system to protect our nation's most cherished marine ecosystems. Many coastal communities, including the 2/3 of the Oregon coast that I represent, rely on the marine sanctuaries in their backyard and the economic benefits they provide through sustainable fishing, recreation, and tourism. I recognize the importance of the fiber optic infrastructure for economic growth and national security, but it needs to be done in a safe and transparent way with a qualified, highly trained workforce and apprenticeship opportunities. That's why I'd like to work with my colleagues in the majority to address the concerns. In Oregon, I have seen firsthand how undersea cable projects can cause environmental harm when they're done recklessly. For example, the Facebook Edge cable disaster off the Oregon coast polluted our ocean and our commercial and recreational fishing areas with over 1,000 feet of steel drilling rods, a drill tip, tools for steering and tracking, and over 6,500 gallons of drilling lubricant. H.R. 261, as written, removes the essential environmental safeguards that marine sanctuaries have, and it eliminates NOAA's ability to charge a fair market rate for the commercial use of public resources, and that's taxpayer dollars. This bill also weakens liability protections that would ensure that companies pay to clean up any messes they leave behind in our public waters. Taxpayers should not have to subsidize for a private company's recklessness. I'm especially concerned that the bill's language referring to activities approved by other federal or state agencies is too vague, and I think we can do better. I'd also like to note that the chair's amendment in the nature of a substitute goes even further than the bill's original draft. The ANS would eliminate the 5-year reviews for any special use permit and would eliminate the requirement that special use permit holders cannot damage our public sanctuary resources. These provisions would apply to any special use permit, not just telecommunication cables. I don't think we want to make it easier to damage our public waters, and that's not something I can support. I do believe there's room for bipartisan compromise that supports building out our critical infrastructure and allows NOAA to fulfill its responsibilities in the National Marine Sanctuaries Act. I urge my colleagues to oppose this legislation as written, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the bill? Hearing none, it is now in order to consider amendments to H.R. 261, and I recognize myself for the purpose of offering my amendment in the nature of a substitute designated Westerman 022 ANS. Without objection, the amendment is considered read and open to amendment at any point. My amendment in the nature of a substitute incorporates feedback provided by the administration to highlight the importance of interagency collaboration in deploying undersea cables. It further clarifies that NOAA is prohibited from requiring a special use permit when permitting an undersea cable within a national marine sanctuary. It also removes the 5-year timeline for special use permits for a wider variety of projects within national marine sanctuaries. This will ensure the robust, thorough permitting process continues. Let me repeat that. The current robust, thorough permitting process will continue, but without additional bureaucratic overlays. I urge support for the ANS and the underlying legislation. And I would also like to remind you, when we talk about a needle in a haystack, we're talking about this cable, which these little fibers are about the size of it, probably smaller than some needles. And it's amazing technology that allows us to communicate at a very rapid speed all across the world. It really is, when you think about this going in the ocean, a needle in the haystack. I yield back. Is there further discussion on the ANS? If there's no further discussion on the amendment, it's now in order to consider amendments to the ANS to H.R. 261. I recognize Ranking Member Huffman for the purpose of offering an amendment designated Huffman number 1. Without objection, the amendment is considered read.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a simple amendment. It preserves the basic authorities that NOAA needs to protect national marine sanctuaries under the Marine Sanctuaries Act. While my colleagues want to give billion-dollar telecom companies a free pass, my amendment would ensure that NOAA can still do its job, consulting on projects, protecting the most sensitive areas, ensuring that companies will pay to clean up any messes they make, and collecting fair market rent for the right-of-way through a national marine sanctuary. Let's be clear about what we're dealing with here. These aren't mom-and-pop operations laying a garden hose on the seafloor. We're talking about massive industrial projects by companies worth hundreds of billions of dollars. The big tech giants are planning cable networks worth tens of billions of dollars that span the entire globe. These companies can afford to play by the rules. They can afford to pay their fair share, just as they do when they cross onshore right-of-ways. But without my amendment, NOAA loses the authority to perhaps say, not here, when a company wants to take a shortcut and tear up the most ecologically sensitive parts of a sanctuary. NOAA would lack authority to require adequate insurance when things go wrong, and things do go wrong, as we've been mentioning. We've already seen what happens when these operations fail. Industrial drilling equipment is often abandoned on the seafloor, causing environmental damage that can last for years. Companies may pay a modest fine and just walk away, but the ocean bears the cost. My amendment would ensure that when the next tech giant decides to drill through a coral reef or a whale migration route, NOAA can step in and say, find another way, or they might say, do it with proper mitigation. It would also ensure that when companies inevitably screw up, that they have the funds or the insurance company or the insurance coverage to clean up their own mess instead of leaving taxpayers holding the bag. Lastly, the amendment would maintain NOAA's ability to charge rent, just like every other federal agency does for the use of public lands. Why should national marine sanctuaries be the only place where billion-dollar companies get free infrastructure rights? They pay rent when they cross private property. They pay rent when they cross federal lands. This is not a lot to ask for. Cables already exist running through sanctuaries, including in my district. So this is not about cables versus national marine sanctuaries. This is about basic accountability and environmental stewardship. We can have both modern telecommunications and protected oceans, but not if we eliminate every safeguard that ensures these projects are done right. I urge support for this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, the purpose of this bill is to codify agencies' attempt to streamline the permitting process. And adding new fees and requirements for bonding only makes undersea cables more expensive, and that hurts long-term investment in the critical infrastructure. As you noted, by holding up the cable, Mr. Chairman, I mean, there really are only a couple of options to get internet across this earth. The one that we've used the most are these undersea cables to get internet to Asia, Japan, and Hawaii. The other option here is internet via space. And so this amendment seems to me like it wants to make undersea cables impossible to lay and encourage investment in Elon Musk's Starlink. So I guess I would urge that if this amendment were to pass, perhaps the gentleman should offer another amendment to the bill to rename the bill the Elon Musk Starlink Investment Act. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion? Ms. Hoyle, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support my colleague's amendment, which offers a reasonable path forward to balance our infrastructure needs with our responsibility to protect the environment. Oregon's coast, and again, we had a major issue with Facebook not being responsible in their project, putting cables underwater in the ocean, and so we do have very relevant experience, and our coast depends on both modern telecommunication infrastructure and healthy marine ecosystems. We've worked across the aisle on similar issues. I believe we can find common ground again today. Representative Huffman's amendment maintains basic federal oversight while still allowing these important infrastructure projects to move forward. It ensures that when companies undertake major industrial projects, they have adequate insurance and follow the same rules that already apply to other businesses. I understand and agree we should streamline permitting processes, and I share the goal of supporting critical infrastructure, and we can do both. We can have effective permitting and responsible environmental stewardship. Up and down the West Coast, the fishing industry, tourism operators, coastal businesses all follow sanctuary regulations and make sure their activities are compatible with the purpose of the sanctuaries. All we're doing with this amendment is ensuring that large telecommunication companies abide by the same rules as these small businesses. I think we can all agree that companies should clean up after themselves when projects don't go as planned. We've seen incidents where equipment gets left on the seafloor. We should all agree that's not acceptable. Actions should have consequences. This amendment preserves the tools of NOAA that NOAA needs to prevent the problems before they happen. I believe this amendment strikes the right balance. Infrastructure development and the purposes of marine sanctuaries don't have to be mutually exclusive. We can support both. I urge my colleagues to consider this reasonable amendment, and I yield back.
Young lady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Ms. Elfreth, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just get so passionate about marine sanctuaries. I jumped the gun a little earlier. But I do have very serious concerns about the definitions in this bill. And Mr. Chair, I share your concerns regarding our need to stay connected to the world, the national security purposes of these undersea cables, and I think we can all agree that we should always demand greater efficiency from our governments. I'm not sure how we do that by firing civil servants, but that's a conversation for another day. But to the amendment maker, if I could ask you just a couple questions, Mr. Ranking Member. Again, the definitions are really important here, and being a smaller state, bordering other states, with the largest freshwater estuary in the country, the Chesapeake Bay, we have 40-plus years of coordination and cooperation in the region, and I'm concerned that the definitions in this bill would pose significant challenges to the work that we have done, particularly the definition of state. The way I read the bill, and please correct me if I'm wrong, let's just say, even though I love our neighbors to the south, Virginia could perhaps under the auspices of this bill, apply for and be approved of a permit that would drastically impact the natural resources of Maryland because we no longer have the protections of NOAA. Is that how am I incorrect in reading the bill in the ANS as written?
The gentlelady, I believe, is correct, and it's been a long time since Maryland and Virginia were on opposite sides of a huge national conflict, but this would seem to invite it with ambiguous language.
Well, actually, the history of that, and I own 2 books on the history of the oyster wars between Maryland and Virginia, which were very serious, and actually, they were very serious when they started our natural resources police. But similar issue of who owns these natural resources when, again, as we discussed yesterday, very eloquently from my friends across the aisle, some of those natural resources migrate frequently between the waters, and we have very arbitrary state lines, especially on the water. So we've established under the ANS is written, Virginia could New York theoretically?
It is totally ambiguous.
Okay.
Just says state.
Okay, so even our friends in California could, if there's a special interest in an undersea cable, could they theoretically apply for and be approved of a cable that runs through a marine sanctuary that impacts my district?
As written, I don't see anything to prevent that.
Okay, and your amendment, I believe, would tighten up that definition and provide that protection.
Thank you for the opportunity to clear that up. Yeah, we fix it. We fix it for them.
Okay, I greatly appreciate that. And again, this may seem small, but it's greatly important when we talk about states' rights and federalism that we also protect what could go wrong if a state downstream decides to impact what goes on upstream and vice versa. So thank you for that definition. It's why I'll be supporting the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Gentlelady's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for recognizing me. During my time in the California State Legislature, I authored a bill that became law, AB 1832, the California Seabed Mining Prevention Act, which protected over 2,500 square miles of seafloor and marine life from seabed mining. It was just as important then as it is now to ensure our marine ecosystems are able to flourish and to protect our environment. This work is essential and why I would like to voice my support for Ranking Member Huffman's amendment to H.R. 261. Ranking Member Huffman's amendment ensures appropriate public notice for any undersea cable license, lease, or permit issued by a federal or state agency who is undergoing this work. In addition, this amendment ensures that companies are properly insured in the event of an environmental disaster and pay their fair share for damages that occur while allowing the Secretary to assess and collect the necessary permit fees. Protecting our sea floor not only makes environmental sense, but it also makes economic sense. Our national marine sanctuary system generates $8 billion in annual revenues. In California alone, coastal tourism, ocean recreation, and fishing industries contribute over $27 billion annually to the economy. From the Channel Islands to Monterey Bay, California's 5 national marine sanctuaries are some of the most diverse and beautiful coasts in our country. We have seen firsthand the damage that companies leave behind on our ecosystems and environment when they run unchecked. We have seen the environmental damage it can have on marine life, fish, and our communities. And we have a duty as members of Congress to protect our environment, especially our oceans across the country. Despite this obligation, the administration and House majority have prioritized cutting agencies, including the $1.3 billion cut to NOAA operations, research, and grants, and the termination of a variety of climate research data and grant programs. As written, H.R. 261 is another example of the Trump administration and my Republican colleagues focusing on cutting corners to the detriment of agencies like NOAA and instead prioritize the selling off of our natural resources rather than protecting our communities and ecosystems. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Recognize myself. I do oppose the amendment. First off, the amendment requires the Secretary to provide public notice for a license, lease, or permit issued under this legislation and the underlying statute. Again, this is a redundant requirement. As I mentioned earlier, there's ample opportunity for the public to provide input under the numerous environmental statutes that govern these projects. I'm going to go back and list these again and remind everyone this legislation does not exempt undersea cables from going through review under the National Environmental Policy Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, Magnuson-Stevens Act, National Historic Preservation Act, or the Coastal Zone Management Act. And again, those are just statutes that are under our committee's jurisdiction, and there would be ample opportunity for the public to provide input under any of those. Additionally, the amendment includes a burdensome, vague provision that would allow the Secretary of Commerce to collect fees for the activities associated with these projects. As written, the Secretary would have broad discretion in calculating these fees and could make a project uneconomical. The amendment also strikes Section 3 from the ANS. Section 3 incorporates technical assistance we received from NOAA to remove the 5-year limit on special use permits for broader activity within national marine sanctuaries. The 5-year limit has been noted as a particularly burdensome part of this process under the National Marine Sanctuaries Act. Section 3 is a positive step forward for both the active management and the multiple use of our marine resources. Again, I urge rejection of the amendment, and I yield back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion on the amendment, the question is on the amendment offered by Ranking Member Huffman, designated Huffman number 1. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Recorded vote, please.
A recorded vote has been requested. Further proceedings on the amendment will be postponed. Well, we got to this point quicker than we anticipated we would get to this point. As well, I would love to vote, except we've got 2 other committees with markups today, and we're trying to coordinate because we have members on those committees. And our plan was to try to vote somewhere around 1:15. So what we'll do is we'll recess and with plans to come back at approximately 1:15 to vote. And I will mention there are sandwiches in the back for members who want to hang around through lunch. Try to treat you right, Mr. Huffman. So the committee's in recess. The committee will come to order. The committee will come to order. The chair notes the presence of a quorum. The unfinished business is on the request for a recorded vote on amendments to the ANS to HR 2555 or 2556. Members will record their votes using the electronic voting system. The question is on the amendment to the ANS to HR 2556 offered by Ranking Member Huffman, designated Huffman number 1, on which the noes prevail by voice vote. The clerk will open the vote.
First one's always sticky.
Has to wake up.
Wow, the T&I ones are a little more responsive, aren't they, Bruce?
I think they're newer.
Is that it?
Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Hearing none, the clerk will close the vote and report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 18 and the nays are 23.
The amendment is not agreed to. The question is on the amendment to the ANS to HR 2556 offered by the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Brownlee, designated Brownlee number 2, on which the noes prevail by voice vote. The clerk will open the vote. Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? The clerk will close the vote and report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 18 and the nays are 23.
The amendment is not agreed to. The question is on the amendment to the ANS to HR 2556 offered by the gentlewoman from Arizona, Ms. Ansari, designated Ansari number 3, on which the noes prevail by voice vote. The clerk will open the vote. Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? The clerk will close the vote and report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 16 and the nays are 26.
The amendment is not agreed to. The question is on the amendment to the ANS to HR 2556 offered by the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Dexter, designated Dexter number 4, on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will open the vote. Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? The clerk will close the vote and report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 17 and the nays are 25.
The amendment is not agreed to. The question is on the amendment to the ANS to HR 2556 offered by Ranking Member Huffman, designated Huffman number 5, on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will open the vote. Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? The clerk will close the vote and report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 18 and the nays are 25.
The amendment is not agreed to. The question is on the amendment to the ANS to HR 2556 offered by the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Randall, designated Randall number 6 revised, on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will open the vote. Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Hearing none, the clerk will close the vote and report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 18 and the nays are 25.
The amendment is not agreed to. The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 2556 offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hunt, designated Hunt 019 ANS. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. Any opinion of the chair? The ayes have it. And the amendment in the nature of the substitute is adopted. The question now occurs on reporting H.R. 2556 as amended to the House with the recommendation that the bill be favorably approved. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. A recorded vote has been requested. Members will record their vote using the electronic voting system. The clerk will open the vote. Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Hearing none, the clerk will close the vote and report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 25 and the nays are 18.
The bill as amended is ordered reported to the House with recommendation that it be favorably approved. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr. Chairman, I give notice of my intention to file supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views on the measures just considered. I ask unanimous consent that this notice be extended to all measures considered at the markup under House Rule 11, Clause 2L. This notice extends to all members.
Without objection, so ordered. The unfinished business is on the request for recorded vote on amendments to the ANS to H.R. 725. The question is on the amendment to the ANS to H.R. 725 offered by the gentlewoman from Arizona, Ms. Ansari, designated Ansari number 1, on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will open the vote. Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Hearing none, the clerk will close the vote and report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 16 and the nays are 27.
The amendment is not agreed to. The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 725 offered by the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Hurd, designated Hurd 18 ANS. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. A recorded vote has been requested. Members will record their vote using the electronic voting system. Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Hearing none, the clerk will close the vote and report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 24, the nays are 17, and present is 1 vote.
The amendment in the nature of a substitute is adopted. The question now occurs on reporting H.R. 725 as amended to the House with the recommendation that the bill be favorably approved. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. A recorded vote has been requested. Members will record their vote using the electronic voting system. The clerk will open the vote. Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Hearing none, the clerk will close the vote and report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 27 and the nays are 16.
The bill as amended is ordered reported to the House with the recommendation that it be favorably approved. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The unfinished business is on the request for a recorded vote on amendments to the ANS to H.R. 261. The question is on the amendment to the ANS to H.R. 261 offered by Ranking Member Huffman, designated Huffman number 1, on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will open the vote. Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Hearing none, the clerk will close the vote and report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 18 and the nays are 25.
The amendment is not agreed to. The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 261 offered by myself, designated Westerman 022 ANS. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is adopted. The question now occurs on reporting H.R. 261 as amended to the House with the recommendation that the bill be favorably approved. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. A recorded vote has been requested. Members will record their vote using the electronic voting system. The clerk will open the vote. Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Hearing none, the clerk will close the vote and report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 25 and the nays are 18.
The bill as amended is ordered reported to the House with the recommendation that it be favorably approved. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The hearing room will come to order. If you're exiting the hearing, please do so quietly. We still have unfinished business. We now turn to the UC package. With the cooperation of Ranking Member Huffman and the other members of the committee, it appears that we have worked out an agreement on 16 bills scheduled for markup today. As we have done before, rather than going through a formal markup process for each of the bills, I will make a single unanimous consent motion to report out the bills favorably with any amendments that have been filed and agreed to. Before we begin, does any member seek time to speak on any of the bills in this unanimous consent motion? Mr. Huffman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to take a quick moment to say I am pleased to support this unanimous consent slate of bills, including H.R. 3168, the USGS provisions of the National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program reauthorization. But I would like to emphasize that this program also encompasses essential and life-saving provisions outside of our jurisdiction, including with FEMA, National Institute of Standards and Technology, and the National Science Foundation. The Senate companion legislation is a comprehensive reauthorization of the USGS, the NIST, FEMA, and NSF, not just USGS like this bill. It is also my understanding that the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee will move pieces of this reauthorization in their jurisdiction at a later date. I just look forward to working with you and our sister committee in the House and our Senate colleagues to pass a comprehensive reauthorization on the floor, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion? Ms. Stansberry, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too support the unanimous consent package, and especially the bills relating to the USGS and the protection of our watersheds. And I did want to also just note for the record with regards to HR 725, which is the Crow Revenue Act, that many of us on the Democratic side are very interested in helping to support the Crow tribe in ensuring their interests, their federal tribal trust interests are protected, and would love to continue the conversation with the Crow Nation and certainly support their sovereignty and economic development. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the unanimous consent motion? I will say that I appreciate the minority working with us on these issues. This committee has historically passed a lot of bills that end up on the floor in form of a suspension bill, and we've gotten a lot of bills signed into law over the years under various administrations. We have our moments where we disagree, but we also have a track record of getting a lot of legislation done in the committee. So I appreciate all the cooperation we got on this UC package. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Federal Lands be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 655, the Dalles Watershed Development Act, H.R. 1276 to remove restrictions from a parcel of land in Paducah, Kentucky, and H.R. 2876, University of Utah Research Park Act. Without objection, so ordered. Ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Water, Wildlife, and Fisheries be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 1917, Great Lakes Mass Marking Program Act of 2025, H.R. 2013, Wetlands Conservation and Access Improvement Act of 2025, and H.R. 3179 to rename the Anahuac National Wildlife Refuge located in the state of Texas to the Jocelyn Nungaree National Wildlife Refuge. Without objection, so ordered. Ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Indian and Insular Affairs be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 410, Alaska Native Vietnam Era Veterans Land Allotment Extension Act of 2025, H.R. 504, Miccosukee Reserved Area Amendments Act, H.R. 2388, Lower Elwha Kalam Tribe Project Lands Restoration Act, and H.R. 2389, Quinault Indian Nation Land Transfer Act. Without objection, so ordered. Ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 2250, National Landslide Preparedness Act, Reauthorization Act of 2025, H.R. 3168, National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program Reauthorization Act of 2025, and H.R. 3176 to amend the John D. Dingle Junior Conservation Management and Recreation Act to reauthorize the National Volcano Early Warning and Monitoring System. Without objection, so ordered. I now ask unanimous consent that the following measures be approved and favorably reported as described to the House of Representatives. H.R. 131, finish the Arkansas Valley Conduit Act with an amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentlewoman from Colorado, Ms. Boebert, designated Boebert 24 A&S. H.R. 183, Law Enforcement Officer Recreation Pass Act, with an amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, designated McClintock 51 ANS. H.R. 410, Alaska Native Vietnam Era Veterans Land Allotment Extension Act of 2025. H.R. 504, Miccosukee Reserve Area Amendments Act. H.R. 655, the Dalles Watershed Development Act, with an amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Bentz, designated Bentz 23 ANS. H.R. 1729, Bolts Ditch Act. H.R. 1917, Great Lakes Mass Marking Program Act of 2025, with an amendment offered by the chair, designated Westerman number 1. H.R. 2250, National Landslide Preparedness Act, Reauthorization Act of 2025, with an amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Ranking Member Huffman, designated Huffman 23 ANS. H.R. 2316, Wetlands Conservation and Access Improvements Act of 2025. H.R. 2388, Lower Elwha Kalam Tribe Project Lands Restoration Act. H.R. 2389, Quinault Indian Nation Land Transfer Act. H.R. 2876, University of Utah Research Park Act. H.R. 3168, National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program Reauthorization Act of 2025. H.R. 3176, to amend the John D. Dingle Jr. Conservation Management and Recreation Act to reauthorize the National Volcano Early Warning and Monitoring System. H.R. 3179, to rename the Anahuac National Wildlife Refuge located in the state of Texas as the Jocelyn Nungaree National Wildlife Refuge. And H.R. 3937, Wabeno Economic Development Act, with an amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany, designated Tiffany 22 ANS. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the motions to reconsider are laid on the table. Ask unanimous consent that the staff be allowed to make any technical and conforming changes to the documents the committee just adopted, subject to approval of the minority. Without objection, so ordered. If there's no further business, the committee stands adjourned.